understood. Ringen stämmer, easy on utfors, adeliges var. Ja, leidon ja, leof netheodon, vaga britta, on baron the shippers, barneven master. Hi, I'm Sam Newton. I'm here trying to retrieve something of the lost soundscape of this landscape. We hear a lot about the landscape, but there's the soundscape too to consider. And we know they were speaking Old English, but I thought it would be a good idea to try and retrieve something of the lost soundscape by some of the language that must have been used around here, some of the vocabulary. With their language, you see more of their world, the way the language structures the world, just as it does the way we speak today. And that's why Tolkien could reach such depths by using those original words in the way he did so cleverly. And having said all that, it all started to form itself together. It's a naturally poetic language, the Old English language. So I found myself composing a little poem in praise of the lady, and that's what I've been doing. And as we know from so many of the Old English sources, you can't have the poetry without the music. And the most popular form of music was the stringed instrument, particularly the six-stringed, what was in Latin the cithara, ultimately the ancestor of the guitar, both linguistically and musically. What is it about six strings? And putting together all the various, often fragmentary clues we have about these instruments, how they were made, what sort of wood they were used to make them, the strings, how the tuning, how were they tuned? And amazingly enough, there's enough fragmentary references to these things to be able to not only reconstruct them from archaeological remains, but tune them according to the original tuning, which is absolutely wonderful. So having said all that, we have an position for musical instrument makers to make authentic replicas. And this one is a replica of the Royal Lyre of Sutton Hoo, no less, complete with the gold and garnet inlays. I say gold and garnet is very cleverly simulated to give it that effect, because it's so difficult to cut garnets with that level of skill and precision at so small a scale. But a great work of Dave Roper did that. The musical instrument itself was made by a veteran violin maker from Suffolk, Con Rendell, who was doing the traditional musical instrument making skills of cutting the wood and air drying it about 20 years before he actually starts to shape the final form of the thing. So we've got, of course, the most musical of all woods is the maple. So the sound board under here is of maple. The main body of this is actually pear wood, a very rare wood, of course, and a lovely one too. Rosewood pegs, they would use that, or boxwood. And originally the strings would have been of gut or even finely drawn wire. Well, they could certainly draw fine wire from the filigree jewellery. Although mine are modern guitar string gut, it's nylon, much easier to use than the gut, especially with the changing weather. And so, having said all that, we can put it all together. We know how they were tuned, as long as your middle two strings are your semitones, in this case B and C. You can then open tuning the and you can hear it resonating. The older it gets, the sweeter it sounds. And by studying how these things were played from cues in manuscripts, etc., the way to do it is to touch selected strings and leave others open, so the open strings thus form chords. So here I've got an A. And of course, the genre of music this kind of instrument would relate to would be what we would call folk music. Stuff that isn't written down, stuff you don't need a large number of chords really to do justice to. And so it's really off the map for most musical histories because it's a native thing, it's handed down. I suppose traditional country music, Irish music, Scottish music, Welsh music, that kind of thing is what we're talking about as its the modern equivalents, so to speak. Although I say modern, it's all pretty timeless stuff anyway. So that's how we play it. Oh, can you hear that sustain? The Fender Stratocaster of the 7th century. And another clue from the archaeology of these things, a very specialised area, the archaeology of music. My colleague Graham Lawson is the archaeology of music. And he points out that in nearly all of the archaeological examples, the bridge there is actually very narrow, and it narrows the strings much more on this one. This one's got a slightly wider bridge, which was an experiment by the musical instrument maker, Con. But the narrowness of the bridge, the narrowness of the strings is clearly designed to make it easier to strum. And I think this was quite a breakthrough in our understanding of these instruments, because most people think a harp, which is what the Old English word for this would be, a harp, we think of an Irish harp, which is actually quite a different instrument. On this, the strings are parallel to the soundboard. On the Irish harp, they are perpendicular, and there are more of them. And that is primarily a plucked instrument. So these things are not primarily plucked. They're a different kind of harp. In fact, we officially, the designation of this now is a lyre. And this the lyre music and poetry then goes back a very, very long way. So the fact that they are primarily strummed, I think, is a very important thing, hence being able to form the chords. And when we see manuscript illuminations of these things, we've got a lovely one from Minster on Thanet in the 8th century of a picture of King David, illustration of the Psalms, King David playing the psalm, but King David portrayed as an Old English king. And his right hand is clearly strumming. And you could also see where the left hand is touching selected chords. So with a combination of all these, really quite ephemeral clues from all sorts of different sources, the archaeology, the manuscripts, the references to the Gothic Kithera, we're able to, I think, feel quite confident about how these things were made and played. We haven't got a recording, so it's all a bit experimental how the music goes with the verse. Precisely the reference, I forget the author. I think it's one of those Latin poets of the 6th century, but he describes the Gothic, what he calls the Gothic Kithera, which is a 6-stringed musical instrument, and he's clearly referring to something like this. And we know that especially the Ostrogoths in Italy were a highly sophisticated lot, combining their traditional poetry and skills with all the new Romanitas. Their great king Theodoric, king of Rome, calls himself king of Romans and Goths, and made a great synthesis of Roman and Germanic culture. That's why they were so famous in Old English poetry and later Middle English and Middle High German poetry, I should say. Dietrich von Bern, as he's known in those sources. But it is very specific, that description, and the real essential detail is, as I mentioned, that the 2 middle strings of the row of 6 have to be the semitones. So we know that is either what we would now call a B and a C, or an E and an F. That's the way. Something the structure of music and we annotate it, we give it a grammar, but somehow the structure of it is part of the nature of the universe. So there we can be absolutely confident that you could, as I say, you could have a different tuning where you've got your middle strings on E and F, but I don't know, I like G and A and C, which is, of course, intrinsic to a lot of folk music, and indeed the modern electric successors of folk music, the blues, and indeed rock. Many of them, great tunes, you don't need many chords. In fact, you can probably get away with 3 chords quite easily. you've got, as long as the backwood is that, as long as that is a good hard solid wood, that's holding the whole body of the thing. And pear wood's just a particular. He just happened to have a nice stock of pear wood. With the main thing is that the soundboard is maple, and I think there's just one exception in the archaeological record to the finds of these things, where it is oak. So you start off with well, a plank basically. You cut out the shape for the arms, and then you hollow out the body, and the arms are hollow right up to that little fitting there. It just seals the gap there. On some of them, though, so the Snake Warrior Poet, for example, the arms are hollow right up to the very top of the arms, which must be actually the extreme possibility because there's a lot of tension on the strings, and but it would have given us a lyre with the biggest sound box of all, which would sound most resonant of all, even more resonant than the King's lyre himself. So, as you say, it's the metal work. It's the warrior poet is preserved because he's lying on his back. He's got his harp cradle in his arm, as you would carrying it, and indeed playing it, and he's got a shield placed over his face and the top of his body, and that it's the metal work in the shield, the bronze fittings, and the boss that preserve just enough fragments by this process, as you know, of the metal mineralizes the organic object, especially the iron. So it kind of fossilizes it, and from the molecular structure you can identify the wood and the type of wood. And Graham was saying it was like dealing with, all that was left effectively of that one was sort of like tiny bits of mouldy Weetabix. But amazing job of reconstruction that he did on that. And that would be one of your court bards or royal bards, or the Schopa, as they're called in Old English. That's the word for an Old English poet. But it's so interesting that so many of these things are found, like at Sutton Hoo, also Prittlewell, in royal graves. You know, the kings themselves were expected, like King David, to be as much warriors and leaders of warriors as poets with lyres to accompany them. And that shouldn't be a surprise in what is still a very traditional oral society. The poetry was their main medium through which they maintained their history and identity and laws, and that was transmitted and maintained across the generations, of course, through the oral tradition of verse, designed to be memorable. So a king above all had to have that skill because it was the medium through which wisdom was maintained and transmitted. And you couldn't be a king without wisdom. Much like today, really, our leaders need to have wisdom. I mean, we've got a warrior poet. Okay, he would be a senior man, but Bede, our venerable Bede, our dear old monastic historian from Northumbria, he tells a wonderful story of the cowman Cadman, who's in the monastery at what became Whitby, St Hilda's at Whitby, and he's in the local pub, the ale house. What's that always? The Beerhouse at the Yebeorship, at the Fellowship of the Beer, and as by way of how does he put it? To enhance the entertainment, to reinforce the cheerfulness, they are singing, and each in turn plays a song, and they pass this round the pub. I don't think it would have the lovely gold and garnet fittings, but it would effectively be the same instrument. It's a harp, what they would call, but we now call a lyre, as I say, hence that's an important distinction. And because he's a bit bashful, he's not very confident at it, he slinks off back to the cowshed before it's his turn, and falls asleep. And during the time he's asleep in the cowshed, he dreams. And in his dream, he is visited by an angel. And the angel says, Cadman, sing me Huatwugu. Sing me something, Cadman. Cadman said, I cannot sing. And there's a lovely Norse version of this where it's a shepherd, not a cowman, a shepherd who falls asleep on the barrow where a warrior poet lies buried. And the poet comes out of the barrow and touches the shepherd on his tongue. And this is clearly variants of the same story, that the Norse one's giving you the older pre-Christian idea associated with inspiration from burials. This lady's been an inspiration, come to think of it. And anyway, the upshot is that in the morning, they both wake up and they're gifted with the power of poetry. And he goes on, B then quotes this wonderful poem that he says about, how's it? We shall herry and heaven riches word, how we should praise the guardian of the kingdom of heaven. And it's presented by Bede as a miracle. It's a lovely miracle story. And then he goes on to compose in English many of the stories from the Bible. And this is, of course, part of the great legendary transition of the religious allegiance from the pre-Christian times with the pre-Christian medium of poetry representing the new learning in the old language so that more people could understand it. And it may well be that Bede is ultimately following the Irish model on that. Irish poetry clearly is doing the same thing, where you have this continuity between the Druids and the old Irish poetry that become the new abbots and abbesses of early Ireland. And the poetry too. Who's that chap? Great missionary into Europe, Columbanus, for example. And we may well have an Irish church influence in East Anglia. Well, we know we have. We've got St Fursey at over near Yarmouth, at Borough Castle as it is now, and not far from here at all, in fact a couple of parishes over, was one of Fursey's fellow Irish missions at Dickleborough, who's left Dickle of Dickleborough. So this idea of using the old medium to further the new wisdom was, of course, an obvious step and a very good idea. And so that's, I think, what Bede's story is all about. Not that he literally woke up in the morning gifted with the power of poetry. He's clearly already something of a poet. The story is making it safe to use what clearly is not just a pre-Christian medium, the poetry, but a deeply pre-Christian medium. In all the parallel Old Norse stories, it's always associated with the god Woden, or Othin as he is in the north. And it's interesting that all of the instruments that we have like this, where we see metalwork decoration, it's always a variant of the bird of prey, the eagle, which was one of the forms that Woden liked to assume when visiting, among other forms of course, the world of mortals. And so Bede's story of Cadman, which gives us, that these instruments were as exactly easy to play and at all levels of society, is really a story about making it safe for good Christian souls to use the deeply pre-Christian medium of Old English poetry. It's kind of like a baptism of the medium, if that makes sense.